Mr. President,
The senator from Vermont.
I'd like to speak about DOGE.
The Senate is in a quorum call.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd ask that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Thank you. I'd like to speak about DOGE. The verdict is in. It's been a colossal failure. It's done immense damage to many of our institutions and inflicted immense pain on innocent people. Also, it's not going to be successful in its stated goal of reducing spending and wasteful spending. But before I do, let me just say what all of us know. Every single person in this United States Senate is all in when it comes to attacking waste, fraud, and abuse. Every single one of us knows that we should kick the tires on every program that we have in federal government and look to see how we can make it be more efficient. And there may be even some programs where we say, you know what, its purpose to serve, it's time to move on. So those of us who are being critical of DOGE are just looking at what DOGE is doing, but not at all quarreling with the notion that every one of us, Republican and Democrat and Independent, has a responsibility to be the best stewards of taxpayer money that we can be. But here's my problem with DOGE. They're not looking in the right places. You know, there is so much ripoff that is going on. Let's just, a couple of examples in our healthcare system. United Healthcare is rigging the system on Medicare Advantage programs. Our seniors, we want them to have the health care that they need, but they set up these billing systems where they paid nurses and forced doctors essentially to over-analyze and over-prescribe and overstate what medical conditions were. And this was not to help the senior on a Medicare Advantage program. This was to pad their bottom line and make billions of dollars. And of course, I'm referring to the study, the series of articles that was in the Wall Street Journal that documented the ripoffs and what I think were corrupt practices by United Healthcare. Where's DOGE? All of that money is just wasted. It's gone into the pockets of executives at United Healthcare. It's gone into shareholder payouts and dividends. But it hasn't gone into improving health care for seniors. Or another one, the pharmacy benefit managers. They are ripping us off so bad. And we had a bipartisan bill with enormous Republican support and Democratic support to curb the ripoffs in the PBM industry. That was in our final budget deal last year. It got derailed. Why? Elon Musk. He was against it. And he gave the word that this has got to go down, and the thing blew up, and we don't have the PBM reform that both sides of the aisle knew was necessary, something that was going to save hundreds of billions of dollars for American taxpayers and allow us to reinvest in health care and make things better. So my first question with DOGE is, why don't you look where the money is, where the ripoffs are, instead of just sending out emails overnight telling people they're fired, whose performance has been absolutely exemplary. So that's the core question I have about DOGE. Why are you leaving these practices that we know are really corrupt and a ripoff untouched, unexamined, and allowing them to continue when it is hammering taxpayers and citizens? We have work to do on saving money, and we have places where it's absolutely essential we act. DOGE is blind to all of those situations, and that's disgraceful, especially when you've got Elon Musk as the person who sabotaged our effort for PBM reform. The second thing is there's a basic question if you're going to go about examining a program. You can ask hard questions. You can look under the hood. How is it working? How is it not working? Where do we have too many personnel? Where can we actually improve the practices and the performance by some reforms? DOGE is not doing that. It literally is not doing that. It has not even taken a day, an hour, to come up with a plan of how to examine the various programs that they're engaging with. What they're doing is firing people. People are waking up in the morning, they're getting an email that says, due to your poor performance, you're gone. Now, this is a situation that obviously is incredibly cruel. You're working at the Department of Agriculture, you're working at the NIH, you're working on a USAID program, and life is going on, and suddenly you get this email out of the blue that it clearly is a mass email, but has a very specific impact on you, your life, your livelihood, and your hopes and dreams. I mean, that is just a savage, savage way to treat people who have been working in our various governmental agencies. And it has enormous impact on our communities. You know, some of the examples, by the way, DOGE is picking on veterans, literally. Thousands of veterans have been fired. The VA has announced the dismissal of more than 1,000 employees. That includes researchers working on cancer treatments, opioid addictions, prosthetics, and burn pit exposure. So the issue here was not how do we help them do that job better? Where are the ways that we can economize? The procedure is you're gone. That's it. President Trump and Elon Musk fired around 350 employees at the National Nuclear Security Administration. These are folks who safeguard nuclear weapons. Now, it was so embarrassing that even Musk had to acknowledge it was a mistake, and those people are now back on their job. But what it does, I think very clearly, is show how there's nothing about a plan to execute a thoughtful way to save taxpayer money. It's just shoot first and aim later. 4,000 employees at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. You know, by the way, that's incredibly important. These are all things that affect red states and blue states. This has no political orientation on one side or the other because the impacts of these are going to be felt by the farmers in Indiana just as they're going to be felt by the farmers in Vermont. Another example, it's really pretty cruel, and I just don't understand this. We have farmers across the country, but I've spoken to farmers in Vermont who entered into contracts with the federal government under the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. And what the deal was is the farmer agreed, like say, to install solar panels or create a buffer zone between cattle grazing in a stream bed, or to change the tillage practices to try to improve the soil. And I get it that President Trump and Mr. Musk are against the Inflation Reduction Act. And they have a right to do everything they possibly can to try to reverse that policy. So this is not about their right to use executive authority. But here's what I don't understand. How do you stiff farmers who went out and borrowed money because they had a contract? They agreed to do certain things around their farm, and then they get an email saying, just kidding, we, the federal government, are not going to honor our contract. And I'm thinking of one farm in my own town of Norwich, Vermont, where folks did borrow the money, and they did the work, and it was in anticipation of the federal government keeping its part of the bargain and coming through with the cash that it had agreed to. And they're told, no, we're not doing it anymore. You know, I know, Mr. President, that you're like me when it comes to keeping your word. You give your word, you keep your word. The folks you represent, the folks I represent, that's what they do, that's what they expect. But we have DOGE saying, well, that doesn't apply to us because we want to, quote, save money. That's just flat out disgraceful and unacceptable. FEMA. FEMA is absolutely essential to help folks respond to a catastrophic event. We need reform in FEMA, and I want to work with colleagues in order to do that. But when that disaster comes, a fire in Hawaii or California, floods in Vermont or North Carolina, hurricanes down south or drought, the response from FEMA is essential because the local community doesn't have the infrastructure in place to provide that immediate emergency assistance that folks need for saving lives and keeping themselves together during that immediate storm event. And we're hearing DOJ and the president want to just abolish FEMA. We have to be there for one another when it's our community that is affected by a catastrophic event where our citizens, the folks we represent, to whom we have a real duty, it's no fault of their own. They're on the receiving end of Mother Nature. And it's always been the tradition in the Senate that we help one another on that. That's not a partisan deal. DOJ is hammering us on that. And the people who get hurt, it's the everyday people that we represent that are working hard, are struggling each month to pay their bills. They're anxious about the safety of their kids. They're anxious about inflation. They're anxious about meeting the challenges of daily life, and they want to make a contribution to strengthening their community as well as their family. And they're getting hammered. And I mentioned, too, among them are the 6,000 veterans who've been fired by DOJ across the federal workforce. I mean, that just astonishes me. How do we say to a veteran who showed up to serve us and protect our country, and to whom we claim we have great respect and allegiance, by sending them an email that says you're fired, with no explanation, no sit down, no face-to-face, just contempt for the value of what they contribute and how hard they're working? I do not understand that. I just don't. Even in a tough business environment where some of our employers have to make tough decisions because they just know that the business can't handle, their business can't handle the workforce that they have, and they may have to make, against their desires, some reductions in force. Our employers will sit down with folks face to face. Here's what we can do. Let's work out a plan. We know you need health care. And DOJ just dispenses with that when it has no plan. So the cruelty of this is so abhorrent to me. We as a society really, despite whatever our differences are, have to have some mutual respect. And it's so essential to people that they have meaningful work. And if we're going to make adjustments, we have to have a plan to include them. And where DOJ says we don't have to do that. And this isn't just about Elon Musk being a multi-billionaire. No matter what happens, it's not going to really affect him. It's about Elon Musk treating people with what I think is the utmost cruelty. You are gone. You are gone. Such disrespect for people who work hard in the VA, work hard in the NIH, work hard in the Department of Agriculture, work hard in the Department of Treasury. So that element of this, we should all be shocked at. I can give a few examples of people in Vermont, but I know I'm like every single member of the U.S. Senate. We can give examples of people in the states we represent. Our Small Business Administration Office has been a real help to Vermonters, very effective. One employee there got a performance review. This is shortly after the performance review. In a very short period of time, you have established yourself as an invaluable asset. That was the performance review. The next day, February 7th, she was fired. because the email said, quote, your performance has not been adequate to justify further employment at the agency. So arbitrary, so unfair, so Elon Musk-like. We have a scientist at the Department of Agriculture, Caitlin Morgan, sustainable agriculture and food systems at the Ag Research Services Ag Research Services Food Systems Center. She was fired despite glowing performance reviews. So what we have with DOJ is an assertion that they're seeking out to cut waste, fraud, and abuse. Who's to argue? There's not a person here that wants to vote in favor of waste, fraud, and abuse. But the reality is, they do have a plan. It's not to look at each agency and then make adjustments so that the agency at the end of the operation will be fit for purpose and better able to do its job. They have a very simple plan. Kill the head count, reduce the head count, fire people. That's it. That's the plan, all right? So we're going to be left with a decimated FEMA, a decimated Department of Agriculture, a decimated National Institute of Health, and then who's going to put it back together again? And this brings me back to the cruelty of a guy like Musk. He doesn't have to worry about that. That's not his concern. Tesla's doing fine. SpaceX is doing fine. You know, things are great for him. But they won't be great, not just for the people whose jobs have been savagely terminated. It'll be bad for the cancer research that scientists are doing. It'll be bad for our Vermont farmers who now find themselves deeply in debt because the federal government stiffed them. It'll be bad for our FEMA response to the next community in our country that gets hit hard by a natural disaster. So we've got to wake up here and be honest about what's going on with DOJ. We do agree, I believe, Republicans and Democrats, that we've got to kick the tires on programs in government. And it's everything from food programs to commodity programs to the Defense Department. And we may have some fierce debates about what the priorities are and what we think is important and what we don't think is important. But that's got to be an on-the-level debate. What Musk has done is just said, hey, leave it to me. Let me send out a bunch of emails. Let me fire a lot of people in a lot of agencies. Let's move fast and break things, and it'll come back together. It doesn't work that way. You know, you destroy the foundation of your house, just like if you destroy the foundation of a governmental program like FEMA or like the National Institute of Health. It just doesn't come back overnight because the organizations that we're trying to build, institutions that are so essential to the well-being of our country, those often take generations to create. It takes the commitment, the service, the dedication, and hard work of Americans of all kinds in all states. This guy, Musk, is just destroying it all and cavalier about it and contemptuous to the rest of America about what he's doing. We can pay the price. So it's wrong what they're doing and how they're doing it. And my view, Mr. President, is that we do, in fact, have an opportunity here because both sides are quite willing to come to the table and ask these questions. How can we do it better? But, you know, if we came to the table and we asked, how could we do it better, we would be looking at the long-term function. How do we have FEMA work better? How do we have our NIH work better? How do we assess grants better? How do we have our small business administration be more effective in helping our young entrepreneurs? We'd be asking those questions. And the other thing we would be doing, I believe this because I have such respect for all of my colleagues here, we'd care about how it affected people. And we might have to make some tough decisions because this program could be cut. This one might have to be expanded. But we wouldn't just send off an email telling people to get lost. We wouldn't just be sending off an email to a farmer who just went to the bank and got a loan based on the credit of the United States of America promising to contribute a grant. We'd be considerate of that. DOJ isn't. In my view, we should all be outraged at the cruelty with which DOJ is operating. It's cruel to the institutions that are important for each of our states, and it's cruel to the people who've been doing this work in good faith for so long. So, Mr. President, we've got to speak up and acknowledge that DOJ is destructive. We can embrace the effort to address waste, fraud, and abuse. We can embrace the opportunity to streamline and save money, make things work better. But we can never abandon our commitment to the people of this country who work so hard. We can never abandon, in a cavalier way, the veterans to whom we have an immense debt of obligation. So, Mr. President, DOJ is pretty dumb and pretty cruel and pretty destructive the way it's operating under Elon Musk. I yield back.
Mr. President, I have 7 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following interns in my office be granted floor privileges until February 26, 2025, Jasmine Wildcat and Carly Woodruff.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak in support of President Trump's energy dominance agenda and to oppose my colleagues who want to keep America literally in the dark ages when it comes to producing energy. This, the greatest energy producing country, is being asked to take a step back. Our energy is cleaner, we produce it cleaner, we transport it cleaner, and yet the Biden agenda had us deferring to other countries who produce energy dirtier, transport it to countries that are paying for it, so the Russians, for example, can spend money to fight a war that we're on the other side of. These are matters that President Trump is addressing and has committed to the American people pursuant to his executive order on January 20th of this year, the first day he took office, to make a priority. As we all know, during President Trump's campaign, he chose to make energy exporting, energy dominance, energy independence a hallmark of his campaign. And he did it because he knows about the connection between energy independence and bringing down inflation. When you go to the grocery store, we see products all over the shelves that have been brought there by trucks that are paying a lot for gasoline and diesel fuel. You see frozen food refrigerators lining the aisles that are plugged into electricity that comes from oil, gas, coal, wind, solar. And the more expensive it is, the more expensive the products are that we buy in those stores. The same is true in any retail store around this country. Over the last 4 years, the Biden administration worked overtime to stick it to the energy industry at every turn, while my colleagues here cheered them on and helped them. On day one, President Biden placed a moratorium on public land energy development that never truly went away until January 20th of 2025, when President Trump was sworn into office and signed an executive order. Wyoming and the West have fallen victim to the previous administration's regulatory regime designed specifically to kill the industry. And then once he kills it, he goes overseas and asks countries like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela to fill in the difference. These are countries that cannot produce energy as cleanly as we can and do. And yet, he'd rather get the energy from them to placate the radical environmental community in this country, that very same community that knows that we can do it cleaner here. During the Biden administration, the BLM declined to offer up lands for oil and gas leasing. And when they did, they ignored the spirit of the law and offered the fewest acres possible. In September 2023, the BLM collected a measly and insulting $27,000 from an oil and gas lease sale in Wyoming. Compare that to the September 2021 lease sale that netted over $1.3 million. The people of Wyoming are elated that President Trump on day one committed to fixing the sins of the previous administration by declaring a national energy emergency. You know, I was in Seoul, South Korea, last spring. And one day we had clear air. The next day it was so dirty that you couldn't see, Mr. President, from where I'm standing to where you are sitting. And I said, what went wrong over 24 hours? And they told me the wind shifted and was coming in from China. China's dirty air was blowing in because China is producing dirty energy. And yet we would rather defer to them when we know we can produce it cleaner. In my state of Wyoming, the Dry Creek Energy Plant is the cleanest coal-producing energy ever produced anywhere. In fact, it is so clean that when they began emitting from that plant, they didn't want to tell the US EPA how clean they could do it for fear that the EPA would apply that same standard to all of America's legacy coal plants, none of which could afford to retrofit to the modern technology of Gillette's coal-fired power plant. In Wyoming, we have abundant oil, gas, uranium, coal, and more. Under the order, Wyoming's public lands can return to Congress the intended goal of multiple use, which includes responsible resource extraction. If you go back to FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy Management Act that passed in the 1970s, it mandates multiple use of public lands, not single use, not preservation or conservation alone, not oil and gas production alone, not recreation alone. It's all of these multiple uses. Energy production is the backbone of my and many other Western states. We're proud to power the nation and to support a president who supports us. With the rise of artificial intelligence and a thriving data center industry, our nation will need all the energy it can get. Mr. President, I was out in California during October and went to AI companies, large, medium, and small, and they all told me the same thing, that the bottleneck for America in being the world leader in AI is energy. We're going to need way more energy than we've needed in the past. And in order to make artificial intelligence work for us and to be dominant in this technology, we need more energy, not less. And we know we can do it cleaner than other countries. If my colleagues succeed in passing their resolution that is under consideration, we're setting the stage for failure. We're setting up our economy and future generations for failure. Voting to approve the resolution is a vote for an unstable energy supply, higher energy costs, and more. I urge my colleagues to vote no against the resolution that is brought by my colleague, Senator Heinrich from New Mexico. I urge my colleagues to stand with President Trump and to oppose this resolution. Mr. Chairman, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alston-Brooks.
The senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, can I inquire whether we're in a quorum call?
Yes, we are.
Could I ask that it be suspended?
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise to describe an amazing journey that I took this weekend. That was a powerful journey connected to my Virginia National Guard and also to issues that are very, very prominent right now in the world. We finished voting on the Senate floor a little bit before 5 a.m. on Friday on the reconciliation bill, and a few hours later I went to Dulles Airport and flew to Finland. Landed in Helsinki at about 1:30 on Saturday, went back to the airport at 1:30 on Monday, spent 48 hours on the ground with one of our newest NATO allies to work together with them on a number of issues. The reason for the visit over the weekend was to see my Virginia National Guard. The Virginia Guard, as most states, are active participants in the state partnership program that was established back in the 1990s, where a state's guard unit connects with the military of an allied country and engages in joint training exercises. Once Finland decided to join NATO, Virginia, which already has a partner in the state partnership program, reached out and said to Finland, we would like to work together with you as well. My governor, Governor Youngkin, helped preside over the signing of this partnership program in 2024, and the Virginia Guard, about 50 members of the Guard, were engaged in the first training exercises in Finland. As governor of Virginia, I used to be the commander-in-chief of the Virginia Guard. I've been very close to them, and I wanted to go see my Virginians training in snowy birch forests in southern Finland this weekend. And I was able to do that. My Guard unit is training with the Karelia Brigade, which is one of the 3 brigades of the Finnish Army. It's got a long history of very heroic service. And on Sunday, it was a delight to drive 2.5 hours outside of Helsinki and visit with my 50 Virginians and to hear the Finnish Army brag about them. That your Guard are well-trained, they're great marksmen, even shooting Finnish rifles, which are different than the rifles they use every day, and doing it in temperatures that are far colder than Virginians normally have to experience on training exercises. In addition to my time with the Virginia Guard, I spent time in Finland with our own embassy team, with representatives from EUCOM, the European Command of the United States Army, with the president of Finland, President Stubb, who is a pretty amazing guy who attended Furman University on a golf scholarship and manages to drop the word y'all into a lot of sentences in a pretty thick Finnish accent. I spent time with the foreign minister and with the permanent defense secretary, and also visited the Helsinki shipyard, which is about to start working in tandem with the United States and Canada to build icebreakers, which is something we desperately need. So it was a great trip, too short, but really powerful, and I returned last night having interacted with my Virginians and known a lot more. There was a sobering element to it, too, and that's really why I wanted to come and speak. To be in Finland, a nation that had to fight 2 wars against Russia in the late 1930s, early 1940s to maintain its independence, and to be there with those leaders on the 3rd anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was sobering and thought-provoking. Finland knows Russia and Russian leadership better than just about anybody because of this hundreds of miles of border between the 2 nations. And that memory of fighting 2 wars against Russia to maintain Finnish independence is still a very present day and palpable memory for the Finns, even though those wars happened in the late 1930s and early 1940s. And you can be sure, Mr. President, that our friends, our allies, those we are training together with, had some pretty strong thoughts about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the commemoration of the 3rd anniversary. I was very disappointed, and I think many were, that yesterday the UN considered competing resolutions on the 3rd anniversary of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. One was a Ukrainian resolution that talked about Russia as the invader, Russia as the instigator of the war. That resolution passed the General Assembly, but in a shocking move, the United States voted against it because of the language placing the blame for the war on Russia. There had been previous resolutions after the invasion, and on the second anniversary, the first anniversary, saying this war was started by Russia, that the U.S. led those resolutions. But now the U.S., through our president, through our Secretary of Defense, through the UN, we don't have a permanent UN ambassador now, but through the U.S. representative at the UN, was unwilling to sign onto and vote for a resolution that talked about Russia as being responsible for the war. And so we opposed the Ukrainian resolution. Who voted with us to oppose this resolution? Russia opposed, North Korea opposed, Nicaragua opposed, another 15 nations opposed, about 60 nations abstained, including China. China wouldn't vote no, China abstained, and 90-plus nations voted yes. The resolution passed, but it passed with the United States unwilling to sign on to the proposition that Russia started this war and should not have done so. There was also a United States resolution that was tendered to the UN General Assembly. That U.S. resolution did not mention anyone as being responsible for the war, but called for a ceasefire and peace, obviously. The U.S. resolution was subject to an amendment that was offered by the U.K. and other nations, inserting the language in that Russia was responsible for the war and should not have done so. That amendment passed, and because it passed, the U.S. ended up not even being willing to vote yes on its own resolution and instead abstained. These Finnish colleagues, who are friends and allies, were pretty candid about their disappointment in the United States for not being willing to state a truth that this war was instigated by Russia. And they deeply want to be partners with the United States on defense, hence their accession to NATO, hence their agreement to the State Partnership Program with Virginia. But they're puzzled with an American leadership, from the President to the Secretary of Defense to the UN, that's unwilling to state that Russia started this war. I came home, Mr. President, last night. It was a long flight, made too long because of a cancellation. I got back a good bit later than I had originally planned, but I had a lot of time to think. And what I thought about was basically this: we need to learn some lessons. We need to remember the lessons of 1938. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, went to Munich thinking he could find an end to war and deliver what he called peace in our time. And he negotiated with the German government and came back to England and said, there is now peace in our time, which anyone in politics would love to be able to say, but we all know that that Munich agreement was a disaster. It was negotiated between England and Germany, but many of the other nations that were later invaded by Germany weren't there, and it wasn't a peace agreement, and they suffered. But did England at least protect itself from suffering by signing a deal and proclaiming peace in our time? No. England was attacked as well after the Germans had attacked Belgium and France and Poland and other nations. So an illusory peace in our time deal was just that. It was illusory. You can't appease a bully. They will bully you and others unless you stand up to them. Or we could remember 1975. In 1975, the Helsinki Accords, right in the community where I was visiting, were signed. The Soviet Union was a signator, along with the United States and Canada and European nations, to guarantee certain principles, including the guarantee of the nation should be able to invade the sovereignty of others. We need to remember that. We celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Accords this summer. We need to remember those principles and who has violated them and who has not. Let's remember 1995. In 1995, as an aftermath of the Helsinki Accords, we helped form the OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. It's the one organization that includes all European nations, and including Russia. NATO doesn't include all. The OSCE does. The OSCE, again, was committed to the principles of the Helsinki Accords, protecting national sovereignty, and we need to remember who has violated those principles and who hasn't. And, Mr. President, we should remember 2020. 5 years ago this week, in 2020, the Doha Accords. President Trump negotiated a, quote, peace accord with the Taliban. A peace accord with the Taliban. Afghanistan was not allowed to be at the table. The government of Afghanistan, that had been our partner, in whom we had invested hundreds of billions of dollars, was not allowed to be at the table. And so, yes, there was a, quote, peace deal. There was peace in our time, but the peace proved to be illusory and catastrophic months later when the United States removed troops pursuant to the Doha Accord. The absence of inclusion of the Afghan government led to a demoralization and a collapse, and the Inspector General that analyzed the end of our military participation in Afghanistan had plenty of blame to assign. Blame to the Biden administration, but also blame to a president, President Trump, who negotiated a deal without including the party that was most affected. I thought of the Doha Accord when I saw the news of negotiations in Riyadh between the United States and Russia to end the war in Ukraine, and noticed that Ukraine was not at the table. A peace deal about a nation's sovereignty where you're not allowing that nation to be at the table is doomed to failure. And we need to remember those lessons in connection with any discussion about the future of Ukraine. Mr. President, you don't even need to completely remember history. Just remember what your mom or dad told you. I know I had this call, and I think most people remember this. You're getting bullied at school, and you go home and you complain to your parents, and what do your parents tell you about bullies? If you give in to them, they will keep bullying you and others. If you stand up to them, they're more likely, not guaranteed, but they're more likely to stop bullying. The United States should have been willing yesterday in the UN to stand up to a bully. The United States should have been willing to say this was an illegal war unjustly initiated by Russia. If you're unwilling to state a truth, you begin in a very weak position. And so my thought in coming home from visiting my own troops, who are sacrificing and risking to train for an action that they know they may one day be called on to support, else they wouldn't be conducting training in a snowy birch forest in southern Finland in February of 2025. They're there because they're willing to sacrifice. It takes sacrifice to protect democracy. Our nation is coming up on the 250th anniversary of our democracy, and not only our democracy, but our leadership role in democracies around the globe. The world needs us to continue to stand strong. Our friends like Finland are hoping and praying that we continue to stand strong. It is my belief that in the heart of the American people, a desire to continue to stand strong. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Louisiana.
Of the floor be granted to the following member of my staff, Jack K. Uhl, for today.
Without objection. The senator from New Jersey.
Not to be undone. To be on the floor, and so it looks like I'm asking for unanimous consent that the privileges of the floor be granted to the following members of my staff: Durva Trivedi, during the pendency of her legal fellowship until September 12, 2025, and Zachary Rosenfeld and Rachel Damond during the pendency of their legal clerkships until April 23rd, 2025.
Without objection.
I'm glad there's no objection. It seemed like I was asking for a lot there, but thank you. Mr. President.
The senator from New Jersey.
I'm grateful. We are dealing with a crisis that all 100 members of this body understand, that has taken the lives of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, and that's the scourge of fentanyl. One of the things that we've been doing as a result of that is temporarily scheduling fentanyl analogs, these horrific substances that are manufactured in order to pour onto our streets such a small amount of this drug, it literally can be the size of one pill. As they say, one pill can kill. It's very important to me that we see the temporary scheduling of this continue until the Senate finds a more wholesome response to this crisis. We must rise to meet this crisis in a wholesome way, in a way that meets the gravity of the crisis and not just continue to do the things we've done over and over again. And so as we are working in a bipartisan way in the Senate Judiciary Committee, with the understanding that the temporary scheduling may expire in the coming weeks, in order to remove that pressure and allow us to work in a bipartisan fashion, I've come to the floor today to ask for unanimous consent that we continue that temporary scheduling while we work in a bipartisan fashion to make sure that we give the most fulsome response possible to this crisis. And so I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S724, the temporary extension of fentanyl-related substances Scheduling Act, which is at the desk. I further ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered.
Senator from Louisiana. Mr. President, for years, one more time, Congress has refused to make a definitive, a permanent decision. It has failed to make Schedule I classification of fentanyl-related substances permanent. Law enforcement needs permanence. It needs a definitive change to combat the opioid crisis and to go after the criminals flooding communities with deadly drugs. Congress's inaction only emboldens China, drug cartels, and other criminals who exploit our communities, and that should not happen. We need a lasting solution. Mr. President, there is no reason to do any temporary extension. We have the bipartisan votes to make the Schedule I classification permanent. This Thursday, the Senate Judiciary Committee, with the support of Judiciary Chairman Grassley and Senator Heinrich, is marking up the Halt Lethal Trafficking Fentanyl Act, or the HALT Fentanyl Act. This legislation permanently classifies fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I controlled substances. Let's be clear, the HALT Fentanyl Act is not controversial. For 2 consecutive Congresses, it passed the House of Representatives with strong bipartisan support. There are enough votes to pass HALT in the Judiciary Committee and on the Senate floor this Congress. My Democratic colleagues' legislation delays that permanency. Schedule I classification will once more be in jeopardy when the next deadline comes around. Law enforcement cannot continue to have this uncertainty. That is why, after my objection, I will ask unanimous consent to pass the HALT Fentanyl Act. This legislation has already passed the House of Representatives and has bipartisan support in the Senate. I hope all my Democratic colleagues will join in supporting the bill. We have a responsibility to provide law enforcement the tools they need to address the scourge of deadly drugs in our communities. Failure to act puts Americans in harm's way. For those reasons, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Because of my objection, I ask unanimous consent to pass the HALT Fentanyl Act to permanently classify fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I controlled substances. The bill also removes barriers that impede the ability of researchers to conduct studies on these substances. The HALT Fentanyl Act already passed the House of Representatives with overwhelming bipartisan support. It has support from Democrat and Republican senators now. This is the bill the Senate should be voting on today, not just a temporary extension that creates greater uncertainty in our effort to address the opioid crisis, but again, one which establishes permanence, something which gives certainty to law enforcement to combat this, as I said earlier, scourge of illegal fentanyl. I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on the Judiciary be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 27 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Reserving the right to object. And this is why I'm down here today. Really, literally, this point Mr. President, and I want to jump here.
The senator from New Jersey.
Thank you for recognizing me. I truly appreciate that. But this gets me excited because this is the point that I want to illustrate. My colleague, far smarter than me on medical issues, I could not have passed organic chem at Stanford. I'm sure he passed it with flying colors. My colleague, who is truly one of my more favorite colleagues in this place because of how rational, pragmatic he is on approaching to real crises like this. This is what I'm begging. I'm hoping he will listen to me, and I'm begging this body to listen to me. We have had a fentanyl crisis in this country of monumental proportions. It is one of the greatest killers in America. Fentanyl and fentanyl analogs have literally been responsible for lowering the life expectancy for Americans. It is one of the greatest crises we have seen to human life in America in my lifetime. And there is so much data-driven evidence, evidence-based answers to this, of how we can approach this crisis. But yet the only bill that we seem to do is a bill that does what we've already done on a temporary basis. I support class-wide scheduling for fentanyl analogs. But here we have this bill, the HALT bill, that my colleague pointed out did pass in a bipartisan way and now is in the Judiciary Committee. The reason why I'm down here is not to drag my dear friend down here because he is a busy man, and I wanted to come over to him before this conversation started to apologize, but I needed to make this point on the floor in this kind of standoff. He is asking us to pass the HALT bill, which would give class-wide scheduling to fentanyl analogs, which we have already done for years. It has been temporarily scheduled. And what has happened to opioid deaths in America? When we have used this that law enforcement has called for, schedule it, give us these tools. Well, we've had these tools. And deaths in the presiding officer's state, deaths in my colleague's state, deaths in my state have continued to go up. Now here's the beauty of the conversation we're having and why we should be passing the temporary one to let us go back to work. And I know this because I know his heart, I know your heart. There are evidence-based bipartisan amendments to that HALT Act that are widely supported. My colleague's partner senator from his state in committee said, I don't understand why we're not putting the test strips on this. Why? Because kids that are using fentanyl right now don't know that they're using this fentanyl analog. Kids in your state and my state, they think they're taking Adderall, not realizing that this has those toxic things that can kill. So here we were in committee with a bipartisan test strip bill that my colleague's partner senator said this makes sense to me, and the one excuse they were using for not doing a bipartisan bill to give us more of a response than doing what we're already doing and wiping our hands and say we did great things was saying we didn't have time because of this artificial deadline. So I'm down here to say, wait a minute, let's do the temporary extension and take time to do bipartisan bills. But don't take my word for it. Take the Republican witnesses that came to our hearing. We just had a painful hearing of law enforcement leaders, other Republican witnesses that told us the scourges of fentanyl that we all know. And those people all said, this can't be all Congress does. That the HALT bill cannot be our only response because the HALT bill permanently schedules what we have already scheduled temporarily. I believe in the 99 members here that know that our response to this crisis cannot be what we've already been doing for the last 5 years. When there are bipartisan bills that we could be putting on this bill to show America that we're not going to just puff ourselves up and make permanent something that was already done in a temporary way. Let me read some of this pleading from Republican witnesses. Republican witness Jamie Puerta, a courageous parent who lost his child to an overdose, testified, "It is imperative that we educate our children on the dangers of any kind of drug use due to the lethality that can come with any kind of experimentation or self-medication. We must have specific fentanyl education introduced to our schools as soon as possible, otherwise more children will die." That doesn't even cost money. We could be doing things through the Department of Education, supporting education campaigns, bipartisan support for that idea. Is it on the Halt bill? No. Let me go on. Republican witness Sheriff Don Barnes highlighted the successes of a multifaceted strategy to address both supply and demand for illicit drugs. These are the bullet points he said that we should do, imploring Congress, don't just do what you already done, do something more. Give law enforcement officers naloxone to reverse overdoses, education for 5th and 6th graders, ensuring a continuity of care and successful reintegration for people who are returning to the community from the scourge of these drugs. Witness after witness, from law enforcement to scientists to doctors, have offered up bipartisan supported ideas so that our response to one of the biggest scourges in our country isn't just to do what we've been doing for the last half decade or more. I've got bipartisan bills on the committee. My colleagues from Texas have bipartisan bills on the committee. And the only excuse that people said for us not to have more consideration, oh, well, the deadline is coming up in a few weeks for our temporary passage. When I realized we've passed temporary scheduling by unanimous consent before. It's not hard to do. I beg of my colleagues, I beg of my colleague that's here and others, we have a moving bill that has to go back to the House because we've already added a manager's package to it. And I promise you, if we add truly bipartisan things that give a more fulsome approach, a more comprehensive approach to stop our children from dying, it'll pass in the Republican-controlled House of Representatives because it was bipartisan here. I'm in agony over the deaths in New Jersey. I've met with parents who look at me and say, "What are you going to do?" Let me read you the words from one of these parents. Susan Austerman, a courageous mother who lost her son to an overdose. I beg of my colleagues, listen to what she said. "I urge you to stop crafting policies based on stigma, false narrative, political loyalty, and most of all, stop using our dead children to justify these failed approaches. Harsher penalties for drugs, like those for the Halt Fentanyl Act, do not deter drug use. They only push people into riskier behaviors, increase the likelihood that someone will die rather than call for help, and make our communities less safe. How many more Americans must die before we finally admit that the war on drugs was a failure?" I'm a former mayor. I oversaw a police department that had to answer to the calls with children dying on floors. They had these law enforcement tools. They would tell me more needs to be done. The Halt Fentanyl Act will get passed. Fentanyl analogs will never again be unscheduled in our country. That's not the challenge right now to save lives. The challenge to save lives in America right now is, what are we going to do more than it's being done right now? Fentanyl analogs are scheduled right now. And if the only thing we can do, the only bill that's moving through here is just doing what we've been doing, shame on us. I'm asking this body to give time, extend the temporary scheduling so that we can work in a bipartisan fashion, so that Senator Kennedy, who said, I want more time to look at this seems rational, this seems logical, seems like something we should do, that when bipartisan senators step up like that and say, I want to work with the man or the woman across the aisle, that we have the time to do it. So God, I'm sorry that my friend, who is truly a great American leader and one of the smarter people in here, I'm sorry that he objected to my bill, but I will stand up in our committee meeting on Thursday and make this same plea that we don't just pass the Halt Fentanyl Act, that we actually put things on it that aren't partisan ideas, that are the ones that law enforcement's calling for, that are the ones scientists are calling for, that are the ones doctors are calling for, bipartisan bills that, dear God, the parents of dead children are calling for us to step up and do more than the same old thing we've been doing around the war on drugs since I was a kid myself. With that, I object.
Mr. President,
Objection is heard. Senator from Louisiana.
I appreciate my colleague's passion. Everybody watching me right now knows somebody who has died from a fentanyl overdose. You cannot minimize the impact of this on everyday families. But what is presented to us as a false choice, I would say even a wrong choice. I think my colleague is saying that unless we pass his amendment to put this temporarily on hold, once more refuse to make a decision to make this permanent, somehow things will get better. Let me repeat what I said in my earlier remarks. This Thursday, the Senate Judiciary Committee, with the support of Judiciary Chairman Grassley, a Republican, and Senator Heinrich, a Democrat, is marking up the Halt Lethal Trafficking or Halt Fentanyl Act. This Thursday is when it's going to be marked up. Now, this is a moving piece of legislation. If you want to do something more than this legislation does, start 2 months ago, start working that committee, don't stop now, call people tonight and say, listen, Thursday, we're going to be marking this up. Will you consider my amendment? And make the case that was so impassionately given, that we got to do more than what we're doing. I agree. And so the way to do it, because this has not yet been marked up, this can still be modified. And by the way, this is not the end of what we are going to do to address the issue of fentanyl. It does allow law enforcement to say, listen, this isn't temporary. We now can kind of go to the bank, if you will. This is the law going forward. But if my esteemed colleague wants to make this more than it is now, that is the opportunity on Thursday. And the process matters. And going Thursday on a bipartisan basis and get that buy-in, sitting down with a senator who's undecided and working through it with that senator, getting him or getting her to a yes is part of that process. Delaying once more permanence. Who's to say a year from now, once more we'll make it temporary, and we'll make it temporary, and we'll make it temporary. There's something about deadlines. Deadlines sharpen a man's mind. If there's a deadline Thursday to get this on, and then when it's brought to the floor, the deadline to amend it on the floor, now is the time to act. But now is not the time to delay. I appreciate my colleague's passion. I look forward to working with him. Neither of us ever wants to go to a family member, to a friend, to a fellow American, and have to comfort them over the issue of another death from opioids. I just think that this is an important step. And if there's more to be added, let's add it. But let's not complain because it hasn't already been added. With that, I yield.
Mr. President,
The senator from New Jersey.
I just want to clarify, because my colleague pounded on the desk and that was hard for me to watch. I'm not here because we haven't been trying to get a bipartisan consensus on this and calling and doing all the work. I've watched this now for 3 Congresses. Number 2, I'm here not because I'm trying to stop the HALT Act. I'm here because I heard 2 Republicans in our committee say the only reason we can't consider bipartisan approaches, even if they're good ideas, is because of the urgency of this moment. So all I'm saying is this is obviously a fait accompli. I just don't want my colleague to walk away thinking this is some kind of stunt. This is my attempt to take away an argument for us to do the work on Thursday. Clearly, it's been objected to. I'm going to go back and try my hardest on Thursday to do something more. And the one prediction, I don't want to call it a prediction, but my colleague says we have a lot more time. I've watched now for at least 3 Congresses that I've worked on trying to get a larger approach to meet the fentanyl crisis. And 3 Congresses, this body has failed to rise to the challenge. And so I'm dying to be here when my colleague tells me I told you so, and I give him permission to do that this body will do something beyond just scheduling. Because as I've read, law enforcement, scientists, doctors, parents are not just asking for the whole Fentanyl Act. They're asking for us to do more to save lives. Now, I've only been here 12 years, but I know the window's open to get things done when something is a must-pass bill and move. This is an opportunity to put some things on to show the larger public that we're not going to do what we always do. I am really worried when this window closes, there'll be a lot of people thumping their chest and saying, we dealt with the fentanyl crisis, and all of these other ideas won't have vehicles to go through. I will not stop working until this body does more than just scheduling what has already been scheduled. People on both sides of the aisle are demanding us to do more, and we don't need to go left, we don't need to go right. We need to do the common sense, evidence-based approaches that are being supported and called for. In fact, some of the common sense amendments are already bipartisan, supported by senators. And so I'm grateful, and I yield.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I have a resolution under the, we call it a CRA, to rescind one of President Biden's regulations. In 1938, we drilled the first well in the Gulf of America, which some people still call the Gulf of Mexico. Since then, 87 years have passed, and we have drilled about 6,000 wells in the Gulf. We have laid hundreds of thousands of miles of pipelines. The oil and gas companies who did this have surveyed, they have x-rayed every square inch of the seabed in the Gulf. They have surveyed, they have x-rayed 311,652 square nautical miles in the Gulf. Put Texas and California together. That's the geographical area that has been surveyed by the oil and gas industry. Why did they do that? For safety reasons. So before they put a platform in the Gulf, they knew that where they were putting it. And number two, to preserve history. Because we have or had a lot of shipwrecks in the Gulf from which we can learn about the past. In fact, as a result of this effort by the oil and gas industry to x-ray the entire Gulf, we have discovered 4,000 shipwrecks. In the waning days of the Biden administration, September of 2024, the Department of Interior, under the Biden administration, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, we call it BOEM, promulgated a midnight regulation. And this is what the regulation said. You have to survey it again. Even though the entire Gulf has been surveyed, you have to do it again, oil and gas industry. If you want to drill a well, or if you want to lay some pipeline, you've got to x-ray it again. Why? Because the government says so. Now, this is going to add anywhere from, I don't know, $20,000 up to potentially $1 million to the cost of drilling a well, to x-ray after an x-ray's already been done. That, of course, is going to increase the cost of the well, which is going to increase the cost of the oil and gas from the well, which is going to be passed on to the consumer, which is going to raise the price of energy, which is going to contribute to inflation in America. You want to know why we had such outrageous inflation under President Biden? Because of regulations like this. And there are hundreds more that increased prices needlessly. That's why under President Biden, the average person's electricity bill in America went up 20% under President Biden. We don't need this regulation. I do not know, well, let me put it another way. I'm not saying that the person at the Department of Interior who came up with this idea is the dumbest person in the world. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that the person at the BOEM who came up with this idea better worry that the dumbest person in the world doesn't die because he's in the running. And my CRA would kill this rule dead as Woodrow Wilson, and I hope my colleagues will vote for it. I yield back all time, Mr. President, on calendar number 15, Senate Joint Resolution number 11.
Without objection. The clerk will read the title of the joint resolution for the third time.
Calendar number 15, SJ Res 11, Joint Resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5, United States Code, of the rules submitted by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management relating to protection of marine archaeological resources.
The question is on passage of the joint resolution. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan,
Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kaine, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse,